When I was a kid, the big trend in media, or at least one of them, was YA dystopia content, with the biggest hitter of the era being The Hunger Games. Now, I read the books obsessively. Like, I have a weirdly clear memory of picking up the Mockingjay hardcover with my mom at a bookstore in Edmonton and talking to a guy who worked there who remarked that he'd just seen they were making it into a movie and that the girl they picked for Katniss seemed like she might be good. I had a Hunger Games t-shirt, I had merch, I had those weird tie-in books for the movies that they sell at the Scholastic Book Fair or whatever. Like, I was really invested in it. When it came out, I went to the midnight screening with a whole bunch of people from my school, and maybe the only ever instance of me actually hanging out with people as a teenager. And of course, it wasn't just The Hunger Games. I'd read about Battle Royale, but I had a weirdly hard time actually tracking down a copy of the book to read as a kid. So instead, I looked for other books that kind of fit the same theme of kids being forced into this life or death situation, and then went beyond books to TV shows, movies, games, etc. And there's more of them than you might think once you start looking for it. Some, like Stephen King's The Long Walk, have a similar approach to The Hunger Games and Battle Royale, with a totalitarian government forcing young adults into a life or death competition where survival of one is directly at odds with survival of others. Others, like Veronica Roth's Divergent or James Dashner's Maze Runner, weren't a zero-sum game. Still very deadly, and young adults are being forced into a life or death situation by adults in positions of power, but one where their own survival was not directly tied to the death of others. There are books like William Golding's Lord of the Flies or Michael Grant's Gone, where the kids are abandoned in a deadly situation and forced to fend for themselves, growing up fast in the absence of adults and getting violent with each other of their own volition. In other stories, like Pretty Little Liars or Danganronpa, the mastermind of the deadly scenario that the children are facing is another child who wants to get revenge or cause chaos. And even though there are adults who are around and possibly even aware of what's happening, it comes down to the teenagers to save themselves. Now, I experienced almost all of these first as a teenager myself, with the exception being Danganronpa, which I first played as an adult. And it was what made me actually consider how strange it is that there is a bit of a weird media trend here. It's not the biggest trend in the world or anything, and I'm not trying to imply that it's bigger than it is, but it is kind of a little bit notable that there have really been any extremely popular pieces of media that revolve around this core premise of children either being forced into an explicit killing game or being forced into circumstances that make them turn deadly. I also want to make it clear that this isn't me saying that this kind of media is bad. In fact, the major reason why I wanted to make this video is that I actually tend to really enjoy this media, but I can't explain why. The idea of kids being forced to kill each other or fight for their lives in deadly circumstances against the clock, the environment, or the conditions of a game they're in is obviously kind of inherently horrifying. And this media has always been at least a little controversial as a result. It's also something that you'd think would lean more, at least in theory, into the idea of torture porn or shock horror, but it generally doesn't. It's not like Saw or Mortal Kombat where gratuitous violence and cruelty is a core part of the appeal, though. It's usually about how children in impossibly difficult circumstances that they were put into by people, usually adults who are stronger and more powerful than them, overcome that, stick together, and eventually ultimately emerge victorious over whoever did it to them. I wanted to talk about this since even before I had a YouTube channel, if I'm being honest, and with the release of the prequel Hunger Games film coming out today, it felt like a perfect opportunity to finally get this off my chest and talk about one of the weirder mini-genres in media to try and answer a surprisingly complicated question. What's up with all this media about kids and killing games? Keep in mind, this video is going to be talking about broad strokes in this sort of mini-genre thing, and to do so, it will be discussing story elements that contain spoilers within the franchises I've mentioned above. However, nothing recent will be discussed, meaning that there will be no spoilers for the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes in here. Also, this video will be using Overwatch footage for the B-roll, but this video isn't about Overwatch. It's just that YouTube has this weird thing where they don't like it if you use clips from movies as B-roll, and also they don't like it when you feature violent content with children, because apparently free speech is dead on YouTube. There's also a good chance this video will get demonetized given the subject material, so if you enjoyed this video and feel so inclined, it would be very greatly appreciated if you picked up a channel membership to support the content. Anyways, on with the video. Part 1. What are we talking about here? I think it's worth making a key distinction early on, and that's the difference between a deadly game and a killing game. I would argue that all the media that I mentioned above, Hunger Games, Battle Royale, The Long Walk, Divergent, Maze Runner, Lord of the Flies, Gone, Pretty Little Liars, and Danganronpa, all fall into a similar category that's worth exploring collectively, but also that there are distinctions between them. For one, some of these are explicitly formalized competitions with victory conditions. Hunger Games, Battle Royale, Long Walk, Maze Runner, and Danganronpa all involve someone making the rules and the participants trying to win, while Divergent, Lord of the Flies, Gone, and Pretty Little Liars are more of an informal challenge rather than an explicit competition. Another difference is about whether it's a zero-sum game or not, whether killing people is actively incentivized and part of the mechanics of the game. The Hunger Games, Battle Royale, The Long Walk, and Danganronpa all require the deaths of other participants for a player to win, while Divergent, Maze Runner, Lord of the Flies, Gone, and Pretty Little Liars are not zero-sum. There's also a pretty major question of passivity versus active participation. Does someone have to become a killer to survive, or is pacifism an option? The Hunger Games and Battle Royale are both built around the expectation that you will have to kill to win, while Danganronpa provides the option to kill to win, but also allows you to win if you can just avoid being murdered and deduce who the actual killers were over and over again. The Long Walk is all about outlasting the competition, but directly interfering with one another, much less outright killing one another, is frowned upon. You're supposed to passively outlast the other walkers, although you can get in their heads a little. In Divergent, Maze Runner, Lord of the Flies, Gone, and Pretty Little Liars, you can survive passively in the sense that there is no need for you to kill anyone or even for anyone to die if you quote-unquote play well enough. I do think all of this media is worth at least acknowledging here, but they're clearly different enough to justify some distinctions, so I'm going to group them into 3 categories: killing games, deadly games, and deadly lives. Killing games are situations where it is specifically a competition, where killing is, at a bare minimum, one of the easier ways to win. The Hunger Games, Battle Royale, and Danganronpa are all outright killing games. Deadly games are a situation where it is a competition or challenge of some sort, but, crucially, where the players are either not active participants in the killing or are simply trying to survive an external deadly force. This would include The Long Walk and Maze Runner. Deadly lives are situations where some external force or act beyond the control of the players has created deadly circumstances that they have to try to survive, typically, but not exclusively, deliberately masterminded, and where there are no clear victory conditions. Think like the final survive objective of Halo Reach. Divergent, Lord of the Flies, Gone, and Pretty Little Liars all fall into this camp. For this video, I mostly just want to focus on the 2 types of games, deadly and killing, but I wanted to mention the deadly live situations just because I do think they often scratch the same itch, just in a more unstructured way. There's still something to be said about the popularity of media surrounding children being forced to try and survive their circumstances and each other, particularly in terms of how those situations present adults. Divergent's characters are on the first steps towards adulthood, having undergone a choosing ceremony that sets them on their adult paths, but still being very young when the adventure starts. Lord of the Flies presents the adults as the representation of safety, with order breaking down in their absence on the island and then being almost instantly restored once they arrive. The children become deadly because there is no greater authority and they grow up fast and chaotic, only to revert back into children at the end. Gone is basically just what if Lord of the Flies, but they're all older and there's some kind of magic powers going on and it's a long-term deal, and it is great. I don't want that to sound like it's being dismissive. An important element of that, though, is that at 15, kids initially begin to blink out of the phase, the area that they're being kept in, but are able to choose to stay if they want to. Pretty Little Liars views adults as, at best, neutral obstacles. Parents need to be navigated in a way that allows the liars to investigate without raising suspicions, and they need to hide it from teachers so the teachers don't inform the parents. They're also often the opposition, whether as part of the A-team or just as their own villains. Also, it does not consider the men of Pretty Little Liars to be insane predators like they are. There are like 6 different adult men in that series who have romantic relationships with children, and that is a conservative estimate, including Ezra Fitz the Felon, who deserves death and is also awful, but the show doesn't really ever reckon with that, so we'll just leave it there. The rest of this video is going to mostly just focus on the killing games and deadly games, since I think those are what's especially interesting, scenarios where the competitive nature is critical to the narrative. Media about kids in deadly circumstances isn't really something that's that shocking. It's tragic, it's sad, it's hard to see kids going through that obviously, but it takes it to a new level of sadism once it becomes a game, once the kids are being played with as toys, and that, I think, is what makes this weird mini-genre strangely compelling, particularly once it becomes an in-universe spectacle. The Long Walk and the Hunger Games are both explicitly entertainment in-universe, with the competitions being televised and spectators taking bets on who will win. Maze Runner, like Divergent, is more of a science experiment gone off the rails, but still with an overtly competitive element against both the environment and the other team, at least in the first 2 books. Battle Royale is a private killing game where middle school students are abducted in secret and forced to kill each other as a way to ostensibly research survival skills and battle readiness for the Japanese government, but in reality is more of a permanent threat that anyone's child can be taken and sent to a killing game if they don't behave. Danganronpa is... well, it depends on the game, and again, spoiler warning here, but each game handles it differently. In the first, the mastermind is televising the game to the world to try and bring about a sense of despair, with adults feverishly trying to fight to rescue them. In the second, the killing game is private within a computer program that was trying to rehabilitate the participants before it was hacked, and there are no public spectators. In V3, the game's setting has been changed to an alternate universe where the killing game is a public entertainment spectacle done as a release of despair. The kids all volunteer, then their minds are wiped, and their identities are replaced with their ultimate identities in service of participation in the killing school life. The outside world is full of hope, and avoids despair by getting it all out of their system in Danganronpa. At least if you believe what the mastermind tells you at the end of the game, but I don't. I've already talked about that at length in this video that I did about Spike Chunsoft games if you want to hear me go on that kind of a tangent. Now, I think a lot of people who consume this kind of content have, at least once or twice, had the thought of, okay, but why is this being done with children? Especially once you become an adult and start to revisit it. It's obviously a really, really controversial choice to have a killing game with kids in it. Lots of games don't even let you kill children unless you deliberately mod it into the game because child murder would likely increase the age rating. Also, it's not like a bunch of children are going to provide the best combat, whether it's for spectators, for research, or even just sadistic satisfaction. Like, there's a reason why there isn't a big audience for U14 MMA. Even in the deadly games, there's no real focus on the competitors being the cream of the crop in terms of athleticism. It honestly is kind of more like Survivor or Big Brother, which fits the typical reality show comparisons that are made in this media. Part of the appeal is generally that these are people who are either 1, relatively normal people forced into extraordinary circumstances, or 2, people who are very good at one specific thing, but where that one thing isn't the only mechanic of the game. If you watch a lot of Survivor, you might think of the strongmen who make it through the tribal phase only to get fucked over after the merge because the strength that helped them win those team-based challenges before isn't well suited to the endurance, balance, or puzzle-related challenges in the endgame. It's also not like there isn't media about adults in killing games either. Series 7 The Contenders is a really niche example of this, which I love, where contestants are primarily adults. And obviously you've got Squid Game, probably the biggest piece of killing game media produced in the last decade. The Zero Escape series is a deadly game featuring adults, and it's not like it's unpopular despite its final entry being the worst game yet created. Again, watch the Spike Chunsoft video for that. Hell, even some sequels in the franchises that we've talked about feature adults as participants, most notably Catching Fire. However, in all of these examples, children in childhood are still treated as major elements. In Series 7, the protagonist Dawn is pregnant and gives birth near the end of the games, and one of the players is an 18-year-old girl being egged on by her parents. In Squid Game, every competition is based on a childhood game to some degree, including the titular Squid Game. And a lot of the framing of the challenges involves presenting the participants as children. Just look at the settings they're in when they play them. They're almost all these big oversized sets with cartoonishly large playsets or dolls or even just bigger houses than normal, all set to frame the adults that are playing as children both to the audience and themselves. In Catching Fire, obviously Katniss and Peeta are still children, and all the participants who are playing the games have played them before as children. And it probably isn't super shocking that this is the first time where the players were able to really mount a rebellion against the Capitol. Which, speaking of, I want to move on to our next section. Part 2. Playing the game. A common theme of killing game media is the emphasis on the games, being bad. Rarely are we shown a killing game where everyone rocks up and is fully informed of their circumstances and eager to go, or at least we're not shown the games through the eyes of a protagonist who sees it that way. Like, throughout the universe of the Hunger Games, there were 75 games, and surely some of those featured a cast of competitors who were just mostly down to kill people. Even the ones we do see, the media doesn't show us the games from the perspective of the careers who love the prospect of competing and killing. We only ever see the Hunger Games from District 12, where the competitors are perceived as some of the weakest who have the least to gain and the most to lose. In Danganronpa, each participant in each game is generally trying to end the games, either collaboratively with the group or independently with their own strategies, and have to be tempted, tricked, and threatened into killing each other to keep it running. V3 tacitly acknowledges this when it reveals that the participants were not unwilling, but eager volunteers who auditioned, but then were brainwashed prior to the games because the killing game isn't actually that fun to watch if everyone's just having a good time. In Battle Royale, uncooperative students will be killed with a bomb in their collar, and in Maze Runner, failure to solve the maze means either, in the immediate short-term death, or long-term also death. The only real exception in our list is The Long Walk, and I think part of the reason why is honestly that it's easily the oldest piece of media we're talking about here, and reflects the changing ways that we perceive these kinds of deadly games. One of the best comparisons I can actually make is to Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, originally published in The New Yorker in 1948. The Lottery is a short story about a town in America where each year the entire community gathers to participate in the lottery. First round determines the household, and the second round features all members of that household drawing slips of paper. It isn't revealed until the very end that the prize of the lottery is that the winner is immediately stoned to death. The lottery was, at the time, hugely controversial. There were a ton of canceled subscriptions for The New Yorker, and Shirley Jackson got hundreds of hate letters. However, curiously, among all the outrage, there was also a profound curiosity. Namely, a lot of those early letters that Jackson got were from people asking where and when the lottery took place so they could go watch. The Long Walk, while it came out in 1979, was actually first written over a decade earlier in the mid-60s, and I think that's part of why it's really one of the only examples we had here where participation is entered into voluntarily and accepted as a valid thing by both participants and the audience. There's not really a criticism of the existence of the Long Walk or the system that would develop it, at least not to the extent that there's going to be a revolution about it, and the protagonist isn't going to go and try and start that revolution anytime soon. This is in contrast with basically every other piece of media we're talking about featuring children in killing games or deadly games, where revolution against the unfair system is usually pretty central. In Battle Royale, the next piece that was published in 1999, the survivors tricked the system into allowing for multiple survivors by faking the deaths of 2 participants, with the remaining person being declared the winner. The 2 other survivors help him hijack the escape ship and plan an escape, with the winner dying of his wounds. The sequel movie, released in 2003, features the survivors of the book and first movie, alongside the survivors of other past Battle Royales as part of a terrorist group fighting to take on the Japanese government and end the Battle Royales, and it's reportedly not very good, but oh well. Also, apparently it's very anti-American according to the reviews, which I think is really funny for some reason. Anyways, the next of these is The Hunger Games, which came out in 2008. In fact, they're all kind of bunched together at this point in time. After Hunger Games was Catching Fire and Maze Runner in 2009, Mockingjay, The Scorched Trials, and Danganronpa Trigger Happy Havoc in 2010, Danganronpa Goodbye Despair in 2012, and then Danganronpa Killing Harmony pops up last in 2017. I'm not including the last book in the Maze Runner series, just because that one seems like it kind of goes off in its whole own thing and it kind of falls off of what we're talking about, but I know someone will say something if I don't comment on why it's not included in this timeline. There's also The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, the book of which came out in May 2020, with the movie coming out today if you're watching this on November 17th. Like I said, we won't be talking spoilers about Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes just because I don't want to spoil a brand new movie and who reads books anymore, but we will talk about the basic details of it alongside the others. I think it's notable that in all these pieces of media that came out between 2008 and 2012, it was about overthrowing the games, about rising up against the system, about recognizing the cruelty of a society that would force children to kill each other and fighting to end it, etc. In the original Hunger Games trilogy, Maze Runner, and the first two Danganronpa games, that was the goal, and that's what we're going to talk about next. Part 3. Ending the games. Something I find really interesting is that over time, this media has kind of circled around on whether or not the Killing Games ending is actually the biggest priority. In a way, the stories originally started out as being about the characters. Their setting and circumstances are, to some degree, kind of inevitable. The long walk can't be truly ended, but over time, the focus of the media became more about systems and how to change them. Battle Royale took a more individualistic approach to this, with the goal being the survivors just escaping to the US. But Maze Runner and the Hunger Games both became stories about addressing the existence of a system that would create a game like this. Not just about the survivors moving on, but them fighting to end the game and change the system. It's not like The Long Walk or Battle Royale didn't reckon with the cruelty of a system that would create these games, but they focused more on the individual characters trying to survive, not trying to change the system. Danganronpa is an especially interesting franchise to consider here though, because Killing Harmony turns the tables. In the first two games, which came out during that 2008 to 2012-ish window, the characters are brought into the Killing Games unwillingly, and the idea of the Killing Games was presented as something society saw as evil being done against their best efforts. But in V3, Danganronpa takes a different approach. The Killing Games have become a spectacle in Killing Harmony, and actually also call back to what we talked about with Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. The Lottery, which I don't think I really mentioned before, is actually kind of about agriculture. At least in theory. The reason the lottery is being done is to try to guarantee a bountiful harvest. They figured that doing this, by purging their violence, by purging their evil, by sacrificing one of their own, they could guarantee good times. Danganronpa actually exists in-universe in V3 as a way for people to purge the despair from their system in a similar way, and everyone accepts the sacrifice of these children as a necessary cost to ensure hope. The children, according to the mastermind, volunteered for the games before having their memories wiped, and only wanted the games to end after they'd been brainwashed into wanting that. Why? Well, because the characters will eventually choose the hope option, whichever option they believe will end the games, but which actually guarantee that they'll continue. They increase the show's ratings, sure, but they also inspire even more hope among people that these children, despite their circumstances, can still choose to have hope. So everyone should be able to. In V3, the 53rd iteration of the Killing Games in this alternate universe, the characters instead choose a dissatisfaction option. Not one that inspires hope, not one that embraces despair, but a secret third option where the season just flops across the finish line and no one's happy. It's the equivalent of a Netflix original series being suddenly cancelled after season 2, which, unrelated, but Reed Hastings is still not going to be seeing heaven for what he did to Sense8. And of course, I know I said I won't be talking about spoilers for A Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, but we can mention its premise, namely, that it's not inherently about ending the games because we know they extend long after this story. This story is about the 10th annual Hunger Games, which continued until the 75th games in Catching Fire. I think it's interesting that between 2010 and 2020 there seems to have been a shift from this story is about the abolition of the killing/deadly game towards this story is about the people who live under/with the killing/deadly game, which I think reflects how people were feeling about the world more than it might initially seem. We wanted to see stories about changing a cruel and unjust world and about how anyone has the power to change it, even a child, back in that boom of YA dystopia in the early 2010s. That the cruelty we experience in life under unjust systems is fuel for change and that all it takes is a spark for it to catch fire. I think over the course of the decade we became, frankly, a lot more jaded and a lot less optimistic, and our stories tended to shift towards explorations of what it's like to live under cruel systems and how people persevere when it seems inevitable and unending. At one point in time, for people in the Imperial Core, that is, the United States and those under its direct allyship and protection, during a period where it seemed like the global democratic order was only making further gains, I think it seemed like a way of individualizing the crises of the era, and of assuring ourselves that it couldn't get too bad. The cruelty of those in power could never go too far, after all, or it would inevitably and eventually be overthrown, because the tenacity of the human spirit is too strong for injustice to last. The past was brutal and unfair, but will only lead inevitably to progress further and further away from it, because the march of time eventually leads us to a better future. All that's needed is someone with enough willpower and courage and strength of their convictions to lead the charge. And who better for that role than a child who survived the cruelty of the system and doesn't want to see it enacted against the next group of children. And I think over the course of the decade, we kind of saw that crumble. We saw that governments not only don't care about how brutally they enact their monopoly on violence on the people, but that a huge amount of the people in society are just kind of okay with it. The Hunger Games works in large part because it really only assumes that the capital is the problem. The people in the districts, even in 1 and 2, are capable of recognizing that the capital is cruel to them and that solidarity with each other is eventually necessary to escape it. The Maze Runner works because even when they're forced into competition, the participants still generally tend towards that solidarity against an unfair system. In the early Danganronpa games, the Ultimates are there against their will, and functionally everyone except the Mastermind is on the same side about the importance of ending the games. games. In Killing Harmony and in The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, the media is recognizing more the reality that many, many people, not just in the core, but everyone, are generally okay with this continuing. Or at least that they aren't going to do anything to stop it. In Killing Harmony, the outside world really wants the games to continue and only stops watching once the players refuse to give them a conclusion. And in The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, the revolution clearly just isn't coming anytime soon. The resources in the districts are still stretched too thin from the war against the capital, and the people are too demotivated to mount a real resistance. Also, obviously, while Squid Game is with adults, I do think you can kind of see this sort of thing happening there too. This presentation of a killing game is something that has not only happened before, but will happen again. The people in this game are not going to be the final wave, and they are not going to overthrow the system. They'll follow the rules and play the game to its completion and then try to figure out what to do with themselves afterwards. Danganronpa V3 is kind of an outlier in this sense, since they obviously do still manage to outsmart the game and end it somewhat on their own terms, but they haven't really changed anything if you even accept the premise of the mastermind. The 53rd season of Danganronpa may have flopped, but every reality competition show has a flop season here or there. Survivor has lasted 50 seasons, and there have certainly been some bad ones. Doesn't mean that Danganronpa is over, especially since the rest of the world still clearly wants there to be a killing game and needs that release of despair. They didn't recognize that the game shouldn't exist, just that the season of it had an unsatisfying ending. Like, this was just the RuPaul's Drag Race All-Stars 3 of Danganronpa. However, again, this doesn't really explain the question at the start. Part 4. Okay, but why kids? For a lot of this video, we've been talking about what this media is about or why it might exist in general, but this video is supposed to be about why there's media about children in killing games. We can point to The Lottery and Squid Game as other examples of this media bookending everything we've talked about. The Lottery, featuring both adults and children, predates every piece of media we've been talking about, and Squid Game is newer than any of these pieces of media featuring an exclusively adult cast. I don't know if this video has really explained why The Hunger Games, or Battle Royale, or Maze Runner, or Danganronpa, or The Long Walk have rosters of characters who are under 18, either in terms of what it says about the stories or what it says about the audiences for liking them. So that's what I'm going to try and do in this section, although I should say none of what I'm going to be talking about here are universal characteristics of this media. Rather, they're my best guesses at why this exists and why it works. I also want to reiterate that this video isn't trying to present this as some major trend, since I don't think it is one. It's just a notable enough mini trend that I think it's worth discussing. Please do not take this as me trying to make a sweeping statement about all the media that's out there in all contexts. I'm just trying to focus on this specific topic here. I know it sounds corny to provide these caveats, but I don't want people to think I'm saying something that I'm not. So, as far as why these stories have rosters of children, I think there are a few main reasons. The first is that, obviously, children don't have a great deal of autonomy. They're not really given the freedom to fight back and haven't really generally learned how to be properly independent at the ages that they're being dragged into these killing games, and that's a big part of it. That the people running the games, whether they're governments or private interests or just deranged freaks looking to kill people, don't want to deal with adults who are going to more than likely realize that they can fight back and don't need to follow the rules. The power dynamic of the strong versus the weak is easy to create when you're strong are all adults and you're weak are all children, and it makes it easier to see why it's so unfair that they're being forced into this situation. The children in these games had no power to ever stop this from happening to them, and are victims of the adults who both enact the cruelty and allow it to continue, and so they must take it into their own hands to save themselves from it. If you have adults in your killing game, you kind of need to explain why they ended up there, and that's easier when they're kids because you can kind of rely on kids not being strong or immediately aware enough to stop it from happening. They're also not just vulnerable to the threat of violence from the powerful, but also vulnerable to social pressure from other kids and other adults like in The Long Walk. Another major element is honestly that it's just easier to empathize with the participants in a killing game if they're kids. I mentioned Series 7 The Contenders earlier, and it's hard to really empathize with someone like 72-year-old Franklin in that movie when he beats the 18-year-old Lindsay to death in a mall in front of everyone. Does he want to do it? No. The game forces him to, and it's kill or be killed. He has no obligation to throw his own life away, but that fact just, I don't know, doesn't really hit as hard when you're watching a boomer kill a millennial in broad daylight with a blunt weapon. Whether it's Danganronpa or The Hunger Games or The Long Walk or Battle Royale, the fact that the participants are young makes it that much easier to see them as having no choice under their circumstances. What are they going to do? Lead the resistance against the killing games? Katniss does do some pretty brutal killing in The Hunger Games. She kills Glimmer and the girl from District 4 with the Tracker Jackers after Rue points them out to her, implicating both Katniss and Rue as being willing to knowingly subject the careers to a horrible death if it means surviving. Later, Rue is trapped by Marvel and killed by him, and Katniss kills him in retaliation. In the movie, Katniss kills Marvel before realizing he had even killed Rue. Her story hits different when it's 16-year-old Katniss killing other children than if she was, say, 32 killing an 18-year-old. And I think you can really feel it in Catching Fire when both Katniss and Peeta return as the only two children against a roster of adults. Battle Royale similarly features a lot of brutality, whether it's in terms of characters like Mitsuko or Kazuo racking up insane kill counts, or just individual acts of over-the-top brutality like Takako Chigusa, the latter of whom went on to inspire Quentin Tarantino to create a similar character played by the same actress in Kill Bill, Gogo Yubari. However, at the end of the day, the characters are still children. Like, Mitsuko racks up the second highest kill count and then dies saying she just didn't want to be a loser anymore. A lot of the characters are troubled kids, having dealt with abuse and cruelty at home or at school even before the games, often twisting and warping their morals. And for a lot of them who do get violent, it's not that hard to see an alternate timeline where they just, like, got to see a good therapist instead. It's a lot easier to empathize with them and see where their lives could have gone differently, where they could have been better, where this wasn't inevitable, and we don't tend to have the same level of empathy for adults in those circumstances. There's also, obviously, shock value. It's shocking in a way we rarely see when it's children committing these acts of brutality against each other. There's plenty of media about adults being violent with each other. The idea that a child could plan an elaborate murder plot against another child is uniquely compelling because it comes from a place of hidden danger. Adults are dangerous to children and each other, but the threat isn't supposed to be coming from inside the house. Sure, kids are mean to each other and might even hurt each other or bully each other, but we're not generally warning kids about stranger danger from other kids their own age. And this media turns around and capitalizes on how children can be dangerous too in the right conditions, either as killers or outright masterminds. A lot of this media tends to present children as growing up fast in their deadly conditions too, bemoaning innocence, loss, and the cruelty of the world that didn't allow them to have a normal, complete childhood. Again, that just doesn't hit as hard when it's adults, because they have gotten to grow up before being cut down, or even just traumatized if they survive. Ray Garrity is pretty bluntly shown to have been permanently traumatized by the end of the long walk when he wins, likely never to recover from the physical and mental toll of the challenge despite getting his prize. And it just hits differently than what happens to Gi-hun at the end of Squid Game, where he's similarly traumatized by the experience, never touching his prize money. I think another major element of this is that children are a lot easier for, storytellers to boil down into having very simple motives and personalities in a way that audiences will generally find believable. Adults are kind of de facto assumed to have more complicated relationships with each other in the world, and that makes writing those stories a little bit more difficult. Again, just look at Zero Escape compared to Danganronpa. Not only that, but it allows children to get the upper hand narratively and makes it a lot more satisfying when they are more complicated than the people manipulating them believed. The game makers in the Hunger Games thought Katniss and Peeta could be manipulated into a jaw-dropping finale, only for Katniss and Peeta to catch them off guard by forcing them to either allow 2 winners or be left with none. We generally tend to like characters who can outsmart the system and can trick a powerful evil villain, even if that villain is also a child like in Danganronpa. Each of the masterminds in those games are the same age as their fellow players, but are clearly smarter and more devious than any of the participants. Or at least they just get more resources. So the participants all have to work together to outsmart them in some way. The mastermind will get cocky or underestimate the abilities of the players, and so they're able to seize the upper hand. A teenage audience can see these stories as narratives about how they are smarter than the adults around them recognize, and how they can fight back against cruel systems if given the chance. And an adult audience can perceive children as being impressive and brave and amazing for being able to achieve things they believe nobody, much less a child, could have accomplished. When you've got adult players against an adult mastermind, though, it kind of changes. Adults are expected to know more, be smarter, and be more mature. It's kind of just more excusable that a bunch of 16-year-olds will go ahead with the Hunger Games because they've been told to, because you assume they don't know better. But if you have a bunch of adults in it, you kind of look at them and think they should know better and be better, and if they aren't, they're a lot less sympathetic. The careers in the Hunger Games versus Catching Fire are a good example of this. You can, to some extent, still empathize with the careers in the first story because they are still children and haven't really had a chance to be better. They've been brainwashed as much as anyone into believing that this is a good and acceptable thing to do. And even if they're cruel in the story, an adult audience in particular is more likely to see them as victims of their circumstances and systems rather than just villains. When the careers are grown adults in Catching Fire, you know that they're more than capable of recognizing how horrible the system is, that they no longer have the excuse of just being children, and that they're kind of just ruthless, vicious killers. Gloss and Cashmere just hit different than Marvel and Glimmer, especially because Gloss and Cashmere truly knew the horrors of the arena and eagerly wanted to be there again. Danganronpa 3, The End of Hope's Peak High School, the anime, also kind of has the same issue. It's one thing to watch Sayaka Maizono get desperate to save the people she cares about and try and kill Leon Kawada and trigger Happy Havoc, and for him to panic and kill her in turn. But Ruruka Endo killing Sonosuke Izayoi in the anime just kind of doesn't come across like that. It's still noble when characters sacrifice themselves for one another, and it's still hard for them to survive, and it's still entertaining in its own way, but it becomes a lot harder to see the perspectives of the characters when they're grown adults who should know better and still go completely insane at the drop of a hat. I don't really know if any of these are answers, or if there even really is an answer to why this media exists and is often so popular. This is all just speculation based on my own experiences with it, and part of why I wanted to talk about it for so long is that I haven't really been able to come to an answer for it. Ultimately, I just wanted to talk about my perspective on it, and pass the questions on to you. Why do you think media about kids and killing games exists? Why do you think it often is so popular? What do you think makes it hit different compared to similar stories about adult characters and adult stories, and do you think that's changing over time? I especially want to hear from you if you're like me and you grew up in the late aughts or early 2010s while these stories were particularly popular, since if you're like me, you've probably also spent a good bit of time wrestling with these stories and thinking, hey, was it kind of fucked up that I liked this and it was popular? And is it fucked up if I still like it as an adult? However, with that said, this video is going to end here. Who knows, maybe one day I'll revisit it, but for now I think I've said everything I can think of without going on complete and total tangents about each of these stories. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more. Have you already seen The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes? And if not, are you going to be watching it after seeing this? Be sure to let me know down below because I am kind of curious about how this video might affect how people see the movie. Next week I'll be putting out another Members' Choice video and doing a fun Just Dance stream on Twitch as part of my Donathon rewards over at twitch.tv/thevivaros, link in the description. And the week after that, on December 1st, will be a channel recap / Q&A video with a community game night right after is also another part of those rewards. If you're interested in seeing me answer some questions from you can either leave them in the comments or join the Discord. The link for that is also in the description. Thank you very much to my channel members: MiniQ, OLS, Cage the Orc, The Afro of Doom, Endballs, Fish Toast, Kirby PPG, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Dextiny, Popsnack, Connor, Yoshi of the Wire, It's Peggy BTW, CatLover192, Sourdough, Illuma Riley, Venus, Monkey12 Ninja, Cadence, Dem, V, and Deleathers. If you'd like to become a member too, you can do so for $5 a month by clicking the join button below. And whether you're a member, subscriber, or just a viewer stopping by, thank you so much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.